12 years, not one written complaint. And they walked me out like a criminal in under 4 minutes. Nobody on that bench knew who she really was. That was exactly how she wanted it. I had $11 left to my name. I spent it on a stranger without thinking twice. She asked me one question that felt ordinary. It wasn't. She was deciding something about me in real time. The woman I fed on a park bench for $11 turned out to be the one person alive who could give me my whole life back. Security walked me out of the Marlowe Logistics warehouse in under 4 minutes, past 60 coworkers who suddenly found their clipboards fascinating. Carrying a cardboard box that held 12 years of my life reduced to a coffee mug, a photo of my daughter, and a jacket I kept in my locker for cold mornings on the loading dock. The warehouse still smelled the way it always had that morning. Cardboard and machine oil, and the particular cold of a building that never quite warms up before 10 a.m. And some small, stubborn part of me kept expecting someone to stop the whole thing and admit it was a mistake, right up until the moment the door actually closed behind me and I was standing alone in the parking lot holding a cardboard box like a man in a movie about someone else's bad day. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I did not steal a single item from that warehouse in 12 years of working there. Not one pallet, not one box, not $1. And yet by the time that door closed behind me, I had been fired for theft, threatened with criminal charges if I so much as questioned the decision publicly, and sent home to explain to my 8-year-old daughter why Daddy wasn't going to be leaving for work in the morning anymore. 2 days later, with $11 left in my checking account and absolutely nothing left to lose, I spent every cent of it feeding a stranger on a park bench, an elderly woman in a plain wool coat who looked like she needed a warm meal more than I did. I had no idea, sitting beside her while pigeons scattered around our feet, that the frail-looking woman I'd just bought a sandwich for held enough actual power to reverse the worst week of my life completely. Within 48 hours, she did exactly that. But to understand how a fired warehouse supervisor with $11 to his name ended up sitting across a boardroom table from one of the wealthiest people in the country, you need to understand exactly how I lost everything in the first place. If you've ever done the right thing with absolutely nothing to gain from it, stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what happened to me afterward is the reason I still believe that kindness, even when nobody's watching, has a way of finding its way back around. My name is Aaron Doyle, and for 12 years I worked my way up from a part-time loading dock position to operations supervisor at Marlowe Logistics, a regional distribution company that moved consumer electronics and household goods through a warehouse on the edge of town. My wife Laura used to tease me that I loved that warehouse with the specific, stubborn loyalty most people reserve for a hometown sports team, and she wasn't entirely wrong. I liked the rhythm of the work, the satisfaction of a shift that ran clean and on schedule, the crew of guys I'd trained myself and genuinely trusted. Laura and I met in a community college accounting class neither of us particularly enjoyed, bonded over a shared hatred of the professor's pop quizzes, and got married 18 months later in her parents' backyard with a borrowed sound system and a cake her aunt insisted on baking herself despite everyone's polite attempts to talk her out of it. She had a specific talent for making ordinary Tuesdays feel like something worth showing up for, and I've spent a lot of years since trying, with mixed success, to hold on to that same talent for Sophie's sake. We had our daughter, Sophie, 4 years before an aggressive illness took Laura from us far too fast, leaving me a 34-year-old widower trying to figure out how to braid a 4-year-old's hair from a video tutorial at midnight while somehow also showing up to a 6 a.m. warehouse shift looking like a functional adult. Marlowe Logistics, to its credit, had been patient with me through that entire terrible year, and I'd spent every year since paying that patience back with the most reliable, careful work I knew how to give them. I'd trained probably 40 different employees over those 12 years, half of whom still texted me on my birthday, and I'd turned down 2 separate offers to move into a purely administrative role specifically because I liked being close enough to the floor to know every one of my crew by name, their kids' names, whose car was currently held together with prayer and duct tape. When the warehouse ran a record-setting quarter for on-time shipments 2 years earlier, my name was the one printed on the plaque in the break room, a fact I mention not out of pride exactly, but because it makes what happened next considerably harder to make sense of. Sophie is 8 now, sharp and funny in the specific way kids get when they've had to grow up a little faster than other kids their age, and the two of us had settled over the past few years into a rhythm that worked. Modest, but stable, her purple star-covered backpack hanging by the door every morning, me making it to every single school pickup I possibly could. The ordinary architecture of a small, sufficient life I'd built carefully out of the wreckage of losing Laura. I want you to understand that stability, because understanding how carefully I'd built it is the only way to understand how completely it fell apart in about 4 minutes on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. The trouble, as I understood it only much later, started with a man named Derek Hansen, who'd been promoted to regional operations manager about 18 months before any of this happened, brought in from outside the company with the kind of polished resume and easy corporate charm that made him popular with upper management and, in my honest opinion, considerably less trusted by the floor staff who actually had to work under him. Derek had a habit of speaking to warehouse crew like we were mildly inconvenient obstacles between him and his next promotion, and I'd clashed with him more than once over shortcuts he wanted taken on safety protocols that I refused to sign off on. He'd pushed, more than once, to shave time off mandatory safety inspections on the loading equipment, arguing the numbers looked better on his monthly reports if turnaround times improved, and I'd refused every single time, which had earned me a reputation with him as, in his own words during one particularly tense meeting, not a team player when it counts. He also had a habit of scheduling his own after-hours visits to the warehouse floor that never quite lined up with any legitimate business reason I could identify, though at the time I chalked it up to a manager simply trying to look busy for upper management rather than anything more deliberate. I didn't know it at the time, but that friction may have made me a convenient answer to a much bigger problem Derek had quietly been creating for himself for the better part of a year. An internal audit that spring flagged a significant, unexplained pattern of missing high-value inventory. Specific electronics that had been logged as received but never appeared in outgoing shipment records. Discrepancies totaling a sum large enough to trigger a formal investigation rather than a routine inventory correction. The audit itself, I learned much later, had actually been triggered almost by accident. A routine quarterly reconciliation flagged a discrepancy large enough that even Marlowe's understaffed compliance department couldn't quietly wave it through. And once the number was large enough to require an actual explanation, someone needed to have one ready fast, before anyone above Derek's pay grade started asking harder questions about his own oversight of the warehouse. I found out later, once the full truth came out, that Derek had been quietly diverting that inventory to an off-book storage unit for months, selling it through a resale network he'd set up carefully enough to avoid easy detection, and altering shift logs and internal shipment records to cover the gap. When the audit finally caught up with the discrepancy, Derek needed someone else. Name attached to the access logs during the exact windows the missing shipments had occurred, and as the supervisor with legitimate after-hours building access. My name was, unfortunately, the easiest one available to attach it to. I was called into a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon by a human resources director I'd spoken to maybe 3 times in 12 years, alongside a senior compliance officer I'd never met at all, and told in the careful, rehearsed language of people who've already decided the outcome before the meeting starts, that an internal investigation had identified me as the individual responsible for a significant pattern of inventory loss. "I understand this is difficult to hear," the compliance officer said, in the specific flat tone of someone reading from a script she'd delivered before. "But the pattern in the access logs is fairly unambiguous." I asked her, more than once, whether anyone had actually cross-referenced those access logs against the building's own security. Camera timestamps, a step that would have taken, by my own estimate, about 15 minutes and would have cleared me completely. She told me that wasn't something she was able to discuss, a sentence I've replayed in my head more times than I'd like to admit. I asked calmly at first to see the actual evidence, the specific shipment records, anything that would let me understand and refute whatever they thought they'd found. I was told that due to the ongoing nature of the investigation, specific details couldn't be shared with me directly, but that a coerced-sounding statement from a junior employee, a kid named Marcus who'd started only 4 months earlier and who I later learned had been quietly pressured by Derek with vague threats about his own job security, placed me at the warehouse during several of the flagged windows, which was true because I was the supervisor on duty, a fact that apparently counted as suspicious rather than simply accurate to my job description. I want to describe exactly what happened next because I think it matters. The compliance officer told me, without a hint of apology in her voice, that the company had 2 options available. They could refer the matter to law enforcement for a formal criminal investigation, which would take months and almost certainly become public within our small industry, or I could resign immediately, forfeit any further discussion of the matter, and the company would agree not to pursue charges or disclose the details in any future reference check. She called this generous. I called it, silently in my own head, the single worst afternoon of my adult life, made worse by the specific, sick understanding that fighting it the right way, demanding due process, actual evidence, a real investigation, would take money I didn't have and time I couldn't spare while raising an 8-year-old alone, against a company with considerably more resources and considerably less interest in the truth than in closing an embarrassing internal matter as quietly as possible. I signed the resignation paperwork with hands that weren't entirely steady, was escorted to my locker by a security guard who wouldn't quite meet my eyes, and walked out through the same loading dock doors I'd walked through roughly 4,000 times over 12 years, carrying a cardboard box and absolutely nothing resembling a plan for what came next. Danny, one of the forklift operators I'd hired myself 3 years earlier, caught my eye near the loading bay and mouthed something I couldn't quite make out through the glass, though I've always assumed, given his expression, that it wasn't anything complimentary about the company. Nobody stopped what they were doing. Nobody was allowed to, and I understood that even as it stung, because I'd have told my own crew the exact same thing if our positions had been reversed. Keep your head down. Don't give them a reason to look at you next. Nobody on that floor said goodbye to me out loud, though I caught a few of the guys I'd trained myself giving me small, helpless nods as I passed. The specific kind of solidarity people offer when they don't actually know what happened but suspect, correctly, that it wasn't the whole truth. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my car in the driveway for a long while before going inside, trying to figure out how to explain any of this to Sophie in a way that wouldn't terrify her. I sat in that driveway for the better part of 20 minutes running through and discarding at least 6 different versions of how to explain any of this to an 8-year-old, before finally accepting that there wasn't a version that would make complete sense to her, only a version that would keep her from being scared, which was really the only version that actually mattered. I settled eventually on the honest but simplified version, that there had been a big misunderstanding at work, that I wasn't going to be going there anymore, and that we were going to be okay, a sentence I said with considerably more confidence than I actually felt. Sophie, with the specific bluntness of an 8-year-old, asked whether this meant we'd have more time to build the blanket fort she'd been lobbying for all month. I told her absolutely, because some questions deserve a yes even when everything else about the day has been a no. The 2 days that followed were some of the leanest, most frightening of my adult life. Without a severance package, without unemployment benefits I could access quickly, and with a mortgage payment due in 9 days, I did the math on our checking account roughly every 4 hours, watching the number get smaller as I paid for gas to drive to 2 separate job interviews that both went nowhere once background checks presumably surfaced whatever quietly damning note Marlowe Logistics had left in my file, despite their promise of silence. The first interview, at a competing distribution company across town, ended after 11 minutes when the hiring manager's expression changed mid-handshake in a way that told me, before he said a single word, that someone had already called ahead. The second, at a hardware store looking for a stock manager, went considerably better right up until the background check portion of the application, after which I never heard back at all, despite 2 follow-up calls I made from a gas station parking lot to avoid using my last few minutes of cell data at home. By that Thursday afternoon, walking Sophie home from her after-school program through the small downtown park near our house because I couldn't justify the bus fare for 2, I had exactly $11 in my checking account and a mortgage payment I genuinely did not know how I was going to make. I dropped Sophie at a neighbor's for a promised hour of playdate, telling myself I needed the walk to clear my head before I had to face another evening of pretending everything was fine. Sophie's after-school program let out at 4, and I'd made a habit, since losing the job, of picking her up on foot instead of driving. Partly to save gas and partly because the 20-minute walk gave me time to arrange my face into something resembling normal before she saw me. That particular Thursday, the sky had gone the flat gray color that usually meant an early winter storm, and I remember being grateful, walking through the park, that at least it wasn't raining yet. It was on that walk, cutting through the park on my way back, that I noticed the elderly woman sitting alone on a wrought iron bench near the fountain, watching a small scattering of pigeons with the specific, patient stillness of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and no particular expectation that anyone would stop to notice her. She wore a plain wool coat that had clearly seen better winters, a simple knit scarf, and sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap against the cold in a way that struck me, immediately and without much thought, as someone who might not have eaten a warm meal that day. I want to be honest that I almost kept walking. $11 is not very much money, and I had a very specific, very real reason to hold on to every cent of it. But something about the particular way she sat there, small and unbothered by the cold in a way that seemed more like practice than comfort, made me stop at the food cart near the park entrance and buy a cup of coffee and a wrapped sandwich, spending every last dollar I had without letting myself think too hard about the math, and carried them over to her bench. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" I asked, holding out the coffee. She looked up at me with a pair of sharp, pale blue eyes that seemed entirely at odds with how frail she'd appeared from a distance, studied my face for a beat longer than felt entirely casual, and then accepted the cup with a small, genuine nod of thanks. I sat down beside her, handed her the sandwich, and we ended up talking for the better part of 40 minutes about nothing in particular. The pigeons, the unseasonably cold weather, a stray comment she made about the fountain having been shut off for repairs longer than the city had originally promised. "You didn't have to do that," she said, wrapping both hands around the coffee cup for warmth, rather than immediately drinking it. "I know," I told her, which was true, though I didn't have a better explanation ready than that. She asked me a few minutes later whether I had children, and something in the way her face changed when I mentioned Sophie, a softening around eyes that had, up to that point, seemed almost clinically observant, made me wonder, briefly and without any real evidence, whether she had grandchildren of her own she didn't get to see very often. She didn't say, and I didn't ask, because some questions you can tell aren't welcome even from someone who's just spent 40 minutes being unexpectedly easy to talk to. She asked me, at one point, in a tone that felt more curious than polite, what had brought me to the park on a weekday afternoon instead of at work, and something about the directness of the question, combined with the particular exhaustion of the last 2 days, made me tell her the truth instead of the vague deflection I'd been giving everyone else. I told her about Marlowe Logistics, about 12 years of clean, honest work, about the audit and the ultimatum and the resignation I'd signed because fighting it properly wasn't a luxury I could afford as a single father with $11 to my name. I told her because she asked, gently but precisely, exactly what I'd have done differently if the company had given me an actual chance to defend myself. I don't know why I told a stranger on a park bench things I hadn't even fully said out loud to myself yet, except that she listened with an unusual, focused attention that made the words come easier than they had with anyone else, including the 2 job interviewers who'd barely made eye contact with me all week. She asked me the name of the company and the name of the manager who'd handled my termination, questions that felt ordinary enough in the moment that I didn't think twice about answering them plainly. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, watching the pigeons resettle around our feet, and then she told me something I've thought about every day since, that in her experience, a person's character showed up most clearly in the choices nobody was going to reward them for, and that whatever had happened at that warehouse, spending $11 I clearly couldn't afford to spend on a stranger told her considerably more about who I actually was than any internal audit ever could. She stood slowly, refusing my offer of a hand, and paused for a moment before walking away, studying me with an expression I couldn't fully read at the time and have thought about often since. Most people walk past a bench like this one without ever really looking at who's sitting on it, she said. You looked. That matters more than you probably think it does. She thanked me for the coffee, gathered herself up off the bench with more effort than her sharp eyes suggested she needed, and told me, almost as an afterthought while walking away, that kindness has a way of finding its way back around, even when you're not the one keeping track of it. I told her to take care of herself and walked home to collect Sophie, and I did not think about that conversation again with any particular weight until 2 days later, when everything changed. What I did not know, sitting on that bench, was that the woman I'd just fed was Eleanor Vance, the reclusive chairwoman of Vance Holdings, a private conglomerate whose various subsidiaries included, among dozens of other companies most people had never heard of, a controlling stake in Marlowe Logistics itself, acquired nearly a decade earlier and left, by design, to operate under its own local management with minimal direct oversight from above. I learned afterward, through her chief of staff, Walter Higgins, that Eleanor had developed a habit in the years since her husband's death of sitting alone in public places dressed deliberately plainly, both because she genuinely valued the anonymity after decades of being recognized everywhere she went, and because she believed, with real conviction, that the only honest way to understand what her company's decisions actually did to ordinary people's lives was to occasionally exist among them without her name attached to anything. Walter told me months later, over a cup of coffee he insisted on buying, that Eleanor had started the habit almost accidentally in the first lonely winter after her husband's funeral, when the walls of the Vance Holdings penthouse had started to feel less like a home and more like a very expensive waiting room. She'd found, sitting on a series of ordinary benches in ordinary parks, a kind of company that didn't require her to be anyone in particular. And over the years the habit had become less about escaping her life and more about remembering, deliberately, what the actual people behind her company's balance sheets looked like up close. According to Walter, Eleanor returned to her office that same evening, unusually quiet even by her normally reserved standards, and asked him to quietly pull the complete personnel and audit file for a supervisor named Aaron Doyle at Marlowe Logistics, along with the underlying inventory discrepancy records that had triggered the original investigation. Walter's forensic team worked through that first night almost entirely on caffeine and Eleanor's uncharacteristically specific instructions, cross-referencing badge swipe data against warehouse security footage timestamps in a way that, Walter admitted to me later with some professional embarrassment on Marlowe's behalf, should have been standard procedure for the original internal investigation and simply hadn't been, because closing the matter quickly had mattered more to local management than closing it correctly. By 2 a.m, the discrepancy between Derek's carefully altered shift logs and the building's own unedited security system was, in Walter's words, not subtle in the slightest, once someone actually bothered to look. Walter told me it took his team less than a day to find the inconsistencies that a rushed, politically motivated internal investigation had apparently missed entirely. Shipment logs with timestamps that didn't align with the building's own security system, an employee statement that, on closer examination by an actual forensic auditor, showed clear signs of having been coached rather than freely given, and, buried in a separate financial system Derek Hansen apparently hadn't thought anyone would cross-reference, a pattern of deposits into a personal account that corresponded suspiciously well with the estimated resale value of the missing inventory. By the following afternoon, Eleanor had ordered a full independent audit of Marlowe Logistics' regional operations, invoking Vance Holdings' controlling ownership stake to bypass the local management chain entirely. And the auditors her team brought in confirmed within hours what the internal records had already strongly suggested: that Derek Hansen had been systematically diverting inventory for the better part of a year, using an off-book storage unit registered under a shell name, and that my own personnel file contained no legitimate evidence of wrongdoing whatsoever beyond my name appearing accurately on standard access logs for shifts I had, in fact, actually worked. I received a phone call that Friday morning from a woman identifying herself as an assistant to Eleanor Vance, asking whether I'd be available to come downtown for a meeting regarding a matter related to my recent employment. A sentence vague enough that I spent the entire walk there half convinced it was either an elaborate scam or some kind of legal proceeding I didn't yet understand the shape of. I nearly didn't answer the call at all, assuming it was another automated survey about my recent separation from Marlowe, the specific corporate euphemism that still made my jaw tighten every time I heard it. When the assistant's voice turned out to be a real person, asking real specific questions about my availability, I found myself agreeing before I'd fully processed what I was agreeing to, mostly because something about her tone made it clear this wasn't a call I could afford to hang up on out of caution. I put on the single aging sport coat I owned for anything resembling a formal occasion, told Sophie's neighbor I might be a couple of hours, and walked into the marble and glass lobby of Vance Holdings Tower feeling considerably more out of place than I had in any room in my entire adult life. I want to describe the specific vertigo of stepping out of an elevator on the 40th floor and seeing, waiting for me near a wall of windows overlooking the entire city, the same elderly woman from the park bench, except now dressed not in a plain wool coat, but in a simple, elegant charcoal suit, flanked by two aides who deferred to her with the specific, practiced respect people reserve for someone whose decisions genuinely shape their careers. She smiled at my obvious confusion in a way that suggested she'd been looking forward to this exact moment, gestured for me to sit, and told me plainly without any theatrical build-up that she was the chairwoman of the company that owned a controlling stake in Marlowe Logistics, that she'd sat on that park bench 2 days earlier entirely by accident and my kindness by pure coincidence, and that once she'd learned the name of the company I'd worked for, professional curiosity had turned into something considerably more personal once her team uncovered exactly what had actually happened to me. "I imagine you have questions," she said, settling into the chair across from me with the same unhurried patience she'd shown on the park bench, though everything else about the room made clear how little patience she typically needed to extend to anyone. I had, in fact, roughly 100 questions, and managed to ask only the most obvious one first: why she'd been sitting on that particular bench, in that particular coat. In the first place, she smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since the elevator doors opened, and told me that some habits, even at 74, a person simply isn't ready to give up. She walked me through the findings herself, methodically, the same sharp attention I'd noticed on the park bench now turned fully toward laying out evidence rather than studying pigeons. The falsified logs, the coerced statement, the off-book storage unit, the financial trail leading directly back to Derek Hansen's personal accounts. The off-book storage unit, when investigators finally opened it under warrant 2 weeks later, contained a modest but telling inventory of unsold electronics still in their original Marlowe packaging, along with a handwritten ledger Derek had apparently kept out of some combination of arrogance and habit, detailing nearly 11 months of diverted shipments in numbers that matched, almost to the dollar, the unexplained deposits investigators had already traced to his personal accounts. She told me Derek had been terminated that morning, and the matter referred to law enforcement for a full criminal investigation, and that the broader audit her team had launched, once alerted to the pattern at my specific location, had uncovered similar discrepancies at 2 additional regional warehouses, suggesting Derek's scheme had been running considerably longer and wider than anyone at Marlowe Logistics local management had ever bothered to notice. distracted as they'd been by the easy, convenient story of blaming a warehouse supervisor instead of investigating their own newly promoted golden boy. She offered me my old position back immediately, with full back pay for every day I'd been out of work, along with a formal written apology from Marlowe Logistics' corporate office. But she also offered me something else, watching my reaction carefully as she said it. A newly created regional operations director role overseeing safety and compliance across multiple warehouse locations, a position that didn't previously exist. Created specifically, she told me without any embarrassment about the favoritism it implied, because a company willing to fire an honest 12-year employee without real evidence badly needed more people in leadership who actually cared about getting it right rather than getting it over with quickly. I sat in that boardroom for a long moment, absorbing the specific, disorienting whiplash of going from $11 and a resignation letter to a promotion I hadn't applied for in the span of 72 hours, and told her, once I trusted my voice enough to speak, that I'd take the new role on one condition: that Marcus, the junior employee Derek had pressured into a false statement, be given a fair, honest chance to keep his own job rather than being quietly punished for something he'd been coerced into under pressure from a manager with actual power over his future. Eleanor looked at me for a long moment after I said that, something unreadable crossing her sharp features, and told her assistant to make a note of it before I'd even finished the sentence. Marcus, it turned out, had already submitted a shaky, tearful resignation of his own 2 days after mine, convinced his career at Marlowe was finished the moment Derek stopped needing his cooperation. Eleanor's team found him before the resignation had even been processed, and when I finally met him again weeks later at the warehouse, now technically one of the employees reporting up through my new role, he thanked me for something I hadn't fully realized I'd done for him until he said it out loud. I called Sophie's neighbor from the lobby afterward, barely able to keep my voice steady, and drove straight to pick up my daughter instead of waiting for the usual pickup time, kneeling down on the sidewalk outside the neighbor's house to tell her, in words simple enough for an 8-year-old to fully understand, that Daddy's job trouble had gotten fixed and that we were going to be more than okay. Sophie, processing this with the specific gravity she reserves for genuinely important news, listened to my explanation with the particular seriousness she reserves for genuinely important announcements, then asked, with total sincerity, whether this meant we could finally get the dog we'd been negotiating about for over a year. I told her we'd discuss the dog separately from the job news, which she accepted as a reasonable if disappointing answer, already moving on to describing, in exhaustive detail, exactly how the blanket fort's second floor was going to work. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and I stayed in touch in a way that surprised us both, I think. What started as occasional check-ins about my new role gradually became something closer to a genuine friendship, built on a foundation neither of us had entirely expected the day I handed her a sandwich on a park bench. Eleanor started showing up every few weeks at ordinary places rather than her usual boardrooms. A diner near Sophie's school once, and a hardware store the following month when I mentioned I needed help picking out paint for the new regional office, an errand she insisted on turning into an hour-long deliberation over shades of blue that had nothing whatsoever to do with her actual expertise and everything to do, I eventually realized, with simply wanting an ordinary afternoon. I learned, slowly and mostly through Walter rather than Eleanor herself, that her own family had grown distant over the years, her husband gone for over a decade, her adult children scattered across the country and more interested in her estate than her actual company, and that our unlikely park bench friendship had filled a specific, quiet loneliness in her life that all the boardrooms and lobbies in the world hadn't managed to touch. Sophie met her about a month into all of this, at Eleanor's own careful, gentle request, and took to her instantly, with the specific, uncomplicated enthusiasm 8-year-olds reserve for adults who take their opinions seriously. Eleanor, it turned out, had genuinely never learned to play the specific, complicated card games Sophie insisted on teaching her that first afternoon, and lost with such good-natured seriousness that Sophie declared her, within the hour, one of her favorite people alive. Eleanor lost that first card game so thoroughly and so many times in a row that I eventually had to explain, gently, that Sophie had been quietly stacking the deck the entire afternoon, a confession Eleanor received with more delight than outrage, informing Sophie solemnly that anyone capable of that level of strategic deception before the age of 9 had a promising future in corporate negotiations. By the time the holidays rolled around, Sophie had taken to calling her Grandma Elle, a nickname Eleanor accepted with a warmth I don't think anyone in her actual boardroom would have recognized, and one that Eleanor herself, when I gently asked if it bothered her, told me was the best gift anyone had given her in over a decade. Derek Hansen was formally charged that spring with multiple counts of theft and fraud, a case Walter told me the district attorney's office considered unusually well documented thanks to Eleanor's forensic team's thorough work, and Marlowe Logistics quietly overhauled its internal investigation procedures across every regional location, requiring exactly the kind of security footage cross-referencing that would have cleared me in 15 minutes if anyone had bothered the first time. In my new role, I made sure it became standard policy everywhere, not just as a rule on paper, but as something I personally walked every new compliance hire through myself. I think about that park bench often, mostly because of how easily none of it could have happened at all. A different bench, a different day, $11 spent on gas instead of a sandwich, and Eleanor Vance remains, for the rest of both our lives, a woman I never meet, and a company that never learns the actual truth about Derek Hansen, until considerably more damage had been done. Instead, I did the only thing that felt right in a week that had otherwise stripped away nearly everything else I thought I could count on, and it turned out that kindness, offered with absolutely nothing to gain from it, really does have a way of finding its way back around, whether or not you ever learn, in the moment, exactly whose hands are holding the other end of it. Sophie still keeps a small handwritten card Eleanor sent her that first Christmas, decorated with a slightly crooked drawing of a pigeon. Eleanor insisted on attempting herself, despite what she cheerfully admitted was a complete absence of artistic talent. And some mornings I catch Sophie studying it on the fridge like it's proof of something bigger than a card, which I suppose, in its own quiet way, it actually is.